Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. The title of this lecture is Global Indigeneity. I have discussed the topic of indigeneity and indigenism before, but I think that focusing specifically on it and putting it into a global focus is important, especially now in the midst of what is happening and what may be about to get worse in the Gaza Strip. Um, there is such a thing as being indigenous. And people who are indigenous to a place, I think, should be regarded as having special rights, as deserving special consideration in an area. I don't know exactly what that means in terms of where people can or should live, but I think that the decision for that should rest with the people who are indigenous to the area. For example, the Gazans are the indigenous people of that land. The Palestinians, more broadly, are the indigenous people of that land, including what is now politically referred to as Israel. The Jews are not indigenous to that land. The Palestinians, therefore, have a special connection, even a spiritual connection with the land that the Israelis do not. I know, as I've said before, as somebody born in New York City, raised in New York City, I am not an indigenous person. When I left New York City, I missed the bookstores. That is what I missed. I did not miss the land. I had no spiritual binding to the land. It was not really a part of my life. The bookstores were. In an age of digital books like Kindle and Google Play, most of those bookstores are now gone. There are still Strands and a few others, but the vast majority of them have ceased to exist. Why? Well, because most people don't need them anymore, and they weren't making a sufficient profit for them to stay in business. For example, Barnes & Noble as a chain exists, Borders as a chain does not. Why? Well, because Borders primarily sold books, almost but not entirely sold books exclusively. That was not true and still is not true with Barnes & Noble. They sell a wide variety of products, including food. I know there is a Barnes & Noble right near me. I go there periodically, but not that often, because the kinds of things that Barnes & Noble sells are not appealing to me. In an age prior to digital books, I would have gone to Barnes & Noble at least every week. Now I feel no attraction to the place at all. Strands in New York, a huge bookstore, multiple floors, one of the largest bookstores in the world. That was my favorite place to go. I would spend hours there, combing through the stacks, looking for things to buy. Now, most of those books I have given away, or in some cases, thrown away. I don't need them anymore. Well, maybe I could use some of them, but the space that they took up was simply too much. And I decided that since I really have not used my physical books in a really long time, that I primarily rely upon digital books, and I have tons and tons of them all stored on my Google Drive, there was simply no reason for me to maintain most of my book collection. And so the vast majority of it, not all of it, but the vast majority of it is simply gone. I am not an indigenous person of what is now called New York City. I wish I were. I would like to feel an indigenous connection to New York City or somewhere. I've met a lot of indigenous people, and they had a certain kind of spirit that I almost envied. It is a spirit that I don't have, and I know I will never have it because I am not an indigenous person. I suppose if you go back in history, at some point in the distant past, my ancestors were the indigenous inhabitants of some place in West Asia. But so what? I'm not. I can go back even further and look at the metaphorical Eve, as she is nicknamed by physical anthropologists and others. Eve is the maternal mother of humanity. And yet, I am not an African. She was in Africa. For me to claim to be an indigenous resident of Africa would be ludicrous. And anybody within hearing range would justifiably laugh at what I would say. So, if I am not an indigenous African, and I've never heard anybody use the metaphorical Eve to claim it, then why do so many Israeli Jews, claim to be living in their homeland, claim to be, in effect, the indigenous inhabitants of a land they have actually stolen from the Palestinians? I don't know. I do know that they are not indigenous. And no matter what they may say, no matter how many complaints they may make, no matter how upset they may get at all the anti-Zionist rallies now taking place all around the world on college and university campuses, they will never become indigenous to Palestine. The indigenous inhabitants were attacked by future Israelis in tanks, driven off the land, killed in many cases, their homes destroyed. That is not the way you treat an indigenous population. You show them respect. This t-shirt that I am wearing, you can only see part of it, but what it says is the original Native Americans. And here you can see that there is a portrait of several Native American people. Those are literally the Native Americans, the founding fathers of the United States, or the founding fathers of what is now the United States. They are indigenous to the land. And when the Europeans came here, beginning with Columbus, and of course earlier than that, the Vikings, and even earlier, the Romans, but particularly when Columbus and his successors arrived in the Americas, they took the land, they stole the land from those Native Americans. Now, although in the US, many properties, many lands have been set aside for Native Americans, those properties are called reservations. In Canada, similarly, the First Nations peoples of Canada have many reserves throughout Canada. But again, the problem is that the land that was given to those Native Americans and First Nations people of Canada is generally not the land that those people originally inhabited. So it was a token, and merely a token, because it was not their land. And what it shows is either scorn on the part of the US or downright disrespect for indigenous rights. That has long been the history of colonialism. Colonialism has trampled on the rights of indigenous peoples for centuries, and it is still happening with the imminent attack on Gaza, the land assault on Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces. No one knows exactly when it will happen. I don't know what imminent means. No one knows exactly what it is. Well, maybe Netanyahu and some of his co-conspirators know, but not me. But I assume it will be soon. And I am not very optimistic about what will happen when those IDF people go into Palestine, go into Rafah, a tiny area of Gaza. I suspect that there will be mass killing. The one thing that has come out of this thing, which I can appreciate to some extent, but it certainly does not compensate for all the suffering which has been experienced by the Gazans, is the fact that global opinion has finally, at long last, turned against Israel. In reality, it should have turned against Israel in 1948 because of what the future Israelis did to the Gazans. But no, that did not happen. Part of it, I suspect, was an enduring sympathy for Jews as the primary victims, not the only victims, but the primary victims of the Holocaust of Nazi Germany. And so it's understandable that there would be some level of sympathy for the Jews and some desire to give the Jews a homeland. As I said in my last podcast, although I am not a Zionist, and I would disconnect anything I am about to say from Zionism, I would say that the Jews deserved some kind of a homeland. But throw out Zionism. I don't care about it. Some kind of homeland is, to me, what Muammar Gaddafi said in referring to a portion of Germany. I believe in collective punishment and collective responsibility. Certainly, most Germans were not aware of the atrocities being performed by Hitler and the Third Reich. But still, they lived in Germany. And as such, they have had some responsibility to make up for what their country did, not only to the Jews, but to the Gypsies, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. And so, at the very least, giving a place to live, a homeland to the Jews, possibly the Gypsies, possibly the Jehovah's Witnesses, and others, would have been the least they could have done. And I sometimes think that if the Germans were actually asked at the time, in the late 1940s, they would have said yes, because they saw the same horrendous photographs of burned up bodies that people in the United States saw in newspapers. They had access to the same media as we did here in the United States. So I think that the level of shame that must have been experienced by the Germans would have impelled them to do something like that. But no, that is not what the future Israelis wanted. They wanted a homeland that was not a homeland that was literally a theft of property from the Palestinians. So literally, Israel is a stolen land. It is not a homeland. Now, does me saying that make any difference? Does the fact that all of these protesters, some of them students on campuses, others professors, protesting, make any difference? No, because the people who hold the strings of power in the Western world are pro-Zionist. They support the Zionist state of Israel, even while the vast majority of the people of the world have turned against it, at least to a degree, but to a degree that I could never have anticipated growing up. I am literally amazed by how much anger has been displayed by people, some of them even Jews. Many of the people who have organized the protests have been Jews and Jewish organizations. That is spectacular. That is wonderful. That brings tremendous joy to my heart. The problem is that I am not optimistic. I don't think it will matter at all. I don't think that it will have any effect on the immediate outcome of what the IDF is doing. Will these protesters stop the IDF from going into Rafah? No, of course not. Benjamin Netanyahu already has his eyes fixed on a possible trial for corruption. And I hope he is at least tried in some way, perhaps even in absentia, for the war crimes he is presently committing. Now, will that matter? I doubt it. Netanyahu is safe in the Zionist entity. Now, if he were to leave the Zionist entity, it is possible that some countries might turn him over to the World Court in The Hague, in the Netherlands. So I think that is going to happen. I am not terribly optimistic. I would like to think so. I would like to hope so. But based upon what we have seen and what we are continuing to see in terms of the support of world leaders, especially Joseph Biden, the leader of the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, supporting Zionism, calling himself repeatedly, nauseatingly a Zionist. No, I don't think that there is much of a chance, perhaps no chance at all, that those protests will have any effect. Still, we do see change. There is always change. Policies, politicians are continuously being challenged. There is never any stability to our world. Our world is always on the brink. What we are on the brink of right now is anyone's guess. But I can't think that it is anything that good. In a way, I am happy to be alive at the present time, to be witnessing the catastrophes, the rolling up of the capitalist world system, the contradictions of capitalism, primarily imperialism, reaching their point of ascendancy, and the effect that those contradictions are now having upon the world. And the fact that, despite the fact that Israel was able to get along with his actions for so long, suddenly, the tide of global opinion has turned against it. It is spectacular. It is miraculous. It is wonderful. But ultimately, it will only be significant if it results in actual change. And so, indigenism, the indigenous Palestinians, the colonial Israelis, there is no match between them. And yet the Israelis are the ones who have the backing of most world leaders. They have been there only since 1948. The Palestinians have been there for much longer than that. And yet the chances that they will succeed in this war, given the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons and the Iron Dome given to them by President Trump, and the Palestinians basically have nothing to fight back with, they are sitting ducks. And I suspect that's what we will see. We will see massive killing and massive destruction when the IDF ultimately invades Rafah. But again, the one positive point in that is that based upon everything we have seen up until now, for the last several months, is that the world will simply not allow Israel to get away with it. If their leaders support Israel, I hope they will not re-elect them. If their leaders support Israel, I hope that they will be overturned in some way, especially the leaders of the third world. I don't think that there is enough class consciousness in the first world to have revolutions, genuine revolutions, to establish a socialist or communist world system. But there might be in the third world, the global south, maybe. And so perhaps, and I don't know, so I'm only guessing, perhaps the flame that could ignite the global revolutions might be the invasion of Rafah. I hope so, because the world is literally tottering on its breaking point. I don't think that it can last much longer in its present form. There is a lot of anger. And when pictures, videos begin emerging of Rafah and the people who died in Rafah, I can only imagine the horror that will be expressed by the people, including the people of the third world, at how the indigenous people of Palestine have been slaughtered. So I think this might be a possibility. It is something I honestly did not consider before. I thought it might take more time for revolutions in third world countries to begin. Now, I am not so sure, because of the fact that there is this global anger at Israel, especially by students, but also by professors on university campuses around the world. It may be enough to ignite the fire of global revolutions. I can only hope, but we will see what happens in the days to come. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.